So it's really my
Right, okay.
yes. So it's really my incredible pleasure and honor to welcome our two guests today, Reverend DeForest Raphael and Reverend Anthony Jermaine Ross Allam. And if gentlemen, you wouldn't mind just quickly introducing yourselves, please, Reverend DeForest.
Yeah, my name is DeForest Raphael. I'm the pastor of the AME Zion Church on the Hill in New York City. I have been in the Christian ministry since 1972 is when I think when I did preach by trial sermon. I've been pastoring since like 81. I had a 12-year break. And now I'm back at the AME Zion Church on the Hill in New York City. I think I may have already said that, forgive me, but I've been there since 2009. I spent 4 years in seminary at the Union Theological Seminary, where I finished my MDiv and STM. I am my wife and I, we are the proud blended family of 5 grown children, seven grown children and 5 grown, not quite grown, grandchildren. So, and we live in Yonkers.
That's amazing. And Reverend Anthony Jermaine, please introduce yourself. Oh, you're muted. Yes.
All right, got to get that mute button. So my name is Anthony Jermaine Ross. You can just call me Jermaine for short. And I'm also an ordained minister with the PCUSA. I was ordained in 2012 in the Presbytery of the Twin Cities in Minnesota, where I am told I was the first African-American man to be ordained in that presbytery.
Oh, wow.
And so since then, I've been here at Union Theological Seminary, working on a PhD in social ethics and political theology. And at the moment, my wife and I are here in New York, and I'm working hard at my dissertation, hoping to finish it up in the next year. And it's good to be here with everyone.
Oh, well, it's amazing to have you both here with us, and Veronica Raphael, DeForest's wife, is here. We're listening on audio as well. But I want, by sort of by over sort of personal introduction, basically how I know DeForest and Jermaine. I know both Reverend DeForest and Reverend Jermaine from my time spent at Union before I returned to the UK, and both gentlemen in their unique ways have impacted my life in powerful ways. Reverend DeForest is a very, very powerful presence in my life in many ways, and I really consider him to be quite the father figure in my life, and just a very sort of solid pillar of strength and compassion, which is what I think very often, I would say all the time, men require. We need strong male father figures in our lives who are strong but compassionate at the same time. So I'm extremely grateful for that to Reverend DeForest, and Jermaine is this brilliant mind who. Reverend DeForest is also very brilliant, and Reverend Jermaine, as putting to my friend Azad, with whom I sort of work on Basil, I was saying that Jermaine is so brilliant, it's scary. Like, but not in a bad way. Like, it's scary in a good way. This guy, no. God bless you. Like, you're going to do great things, and you already are doing great things. And both of you are very great people, and it's a real blessing to have you both in my life. I wanted to sort of.
I need to look around to see who it is that you're talking about. That's
know, right?
Right. I'm like, it's right.
Well, no, I mean you're both very humble, but one of the things that one of the motivations behind doing these sort of organizing these discussions is first and foremost that they're for me a learning opportunity. I consider myself, like a lifelong learner. And this is, of course, to my mind, a very, very important topic, which we've titled Black Theologies, the Future of America. And I wanted to just give very quick background as to some of the intentionality or the sort of, how I came about with this, whatever the title is. I was actually revisiting Dave Chappelle's monologue on the Saturday Night Live, the last one that he did after Biden won, which of course bookended the beginning and the end of the Trump presidency, because he was the end book, and the sort of beginning book was when he appeared on SNL after Trump won. And I sort of in many ways consider Dave Chappelle to be, well, certainly one of the great minds thinking and challenging people across the world, but in particular people in the US context, to think about these very complex and painful social relations vis-a-vis race and other injustices, racially motivated injustices. And I sometimes when I listen to him, it sounds to me like a preacher is preaching, like in the best way possible, but of course using humor. And he had this sort of very unsettling, but very profound, unsettling as far as really making us think about some of these things. He said, come get to your lessons, right? Come get to your N lessons, the N word, to that, the African-American experience historically, to remind ourselves, because it bears repeating and reminding ourselves, has historically been one that has, words are so weak that unimaginable injustices have been done to the African-American body and mind and being historically until today. And yet the African-American experience is such that they have managed to found, as a people, as a community, these incredible resources, inner resources, to keep going in the face of seemingly insuperable and unimaginably difficult circumstances. So anyway, all of that is to say that and to continue Chappelle's sort of point, that the direction in which the US is going, increasingly the world is going, really, and wherever America goes, for better and for worse, very often for worse, the rest of the world tends to follow. The direction the US is going is a very sort of destructive direction. And if people are to save themselves, not least of all white people, was Chappelle's point, then we need to learn from, we all need to learn from the African-American experience. There's a lot of wisdom there. So anyway, that was just by way of background as to the title and the motivation as well behind the provocation. And I wanted to start as far as questions. Again, this is really not my area of expertise, for which I apologize ahead of time, but I'm still learning. James Cohen, of course, is if any mistakes I make, please do correct me, because we learn through corrections. James Cohen, of course, is in many ways, he's the main person who sort of formally articulates a Black theology. And I was hoping you could speak, both of you, a little bit to James Cohen, his sort of message, how I was really struck by his idea of combining. So when he talks about Black theology, he says that he takes the idea of Black, or the Black man or the Black experience, from Malcolm X, and he takes the idea of theology from Martin Luther King, and two people who very often in sort of mainstream, let's say, whitewashed discourse, the two people almost seen as polar opposites. And the sort of Martin Luther King approach to things, that's more acceptable. But and so Cohen does something very radical, and I apologize for going on and on here, but I'll stop very shortly just by mentioning, as far as Malcolm X is concerned, I read his autobiography, 21 years ago now, and it completely, it shook me up in very powerful ways. And anyways, hence the idea of theologies. As far as I can tell, there isn't one Black theology. It's something that is in the plural, which is also a positive thing. So if we could start perhaps with Reverend DeForest, please. And I think you're on mute, Reverend.
Sorry about that.
No, not at all.
Yeah, I think that, interestingly enough, both Malcolm and, Jermaine, Hassan is right, jump in here if I'm saying something that that needs correction. But it seemed that both of them, at the end of their lives, they were kind of moving toward each other. Some of the things that Malcolm had been saying, Martin was saying near the end. And the same can be said about Martin. Martin was thinking that maybe he had made a mistake with regard to this notion of integration. Maybe you can't integrate into, maybe this notion of America having a conscience is not something that makes sense because of the way America is behaving in the world. But they both, I remember thinking, because I was very much alive and very conscious and kind of trying to pay some closer attention when they were around, I would listen to the both of them and I would hear what one was saying rather than being diametrically opposed to one another, that there were ways in which what Martin was saying would complement what Malcolm was saying, and what Malcolm was saying would in some ways complement what Martin was saying. So this notion that one person, and we're always kind of often, if we're not careful, allow what Malcolm would say, your enemy, to define, the contours of your discussion. So what white people say that is okay to hear out of any Black person's mouth, it becomes the defining context, which is just, the more I think about that, the more not just enraged I am by it, but I'm becoming so more increasingly aware how untrue it is. Malcolm said, only a fool would allow his enemy to educate his children. And that's so true. And we're seeing that now. We all spent time at Union. There are things going on at Union that ain't got nothing to do with Black liberation. Although they got Dr. Cone's portrait hanging on a wall, on a tree, a piece of wood, by the way. And he's on a cross, for one thing, and it is a piece of wood, that the material. And there are people at Union that, and I don't know if Jermaine knows this, but there are people at Union on the faculty now that always kind of poo-pooed Dr. Cone. Did not think that he was an intellectual giant. He didn't have much intellectual heft. That Black theology, I remember one young white student saying that Black theology was intellectually flaccid, was the term that was used. So, I say all this to say, in part, having to rethink who it is that we are and what we think and what matters to us. You're always doing it against the noise of a society that cares neither for Malcolm nor Martin. And they will use the differences or the divisions or the disagreements that they see among them against everyone, because that's the only reason that they're even making comments, because they're just looking to create this division that they can then exploit. It's an old trick with just another name. So we saw it with Malcolm, and we saw it with Obama. And the newly reappointed star faculty member at Union Theological Seminary, Cornel West. I'm sure Cornel had a lot to say about Trump, but you would never see him on nationwide television. But every time they wanted to have something negative to say about Obama, they would highlight what Cornel West had to say about him. So it's just the way they play that. So I'm rambling now, but essentially I think that we need to learn how, and I'm struggling with this myself, to be able to hold ideas that may seem to conflict in and of themselves in a kind of creative tension, because they're not all wrong or necessarily all right, but they can feed each other, they can nourish one another. So I think I think that Malcolm and Martin were perfect examples and Cone would say this. He says Malcolm would not have been as much to him without Martin. And Martin, in his book, Martin and Malcolm, Dream or a Nightmare, he talked about that. He said that Malcolm would not have had the power that he had without Martin, nor Martin without Malcolm. So he read them together, and they both fed his fire and his intellectual act.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you so much, Reverend DeForest. And Reverend Jermaine, if you could say a few words, related words, please.
Absolutely. And well said, DeForest. I couldn't have said it better. What I would also add to that, I think, is that Professor James Cone looked at Malcolm and Martin in such a way that it gave us an understanding not of these two people as diametrically opposed perspectives on the United States and Black life more generally. But I think what his work did is actually give them back to the community as complementary figures. And to a certain extent, we can look at Martin Luther King Jr. as someone who is invested in the aspect of American life that can do better by Black people. And at the same time, we could also look at Malcolm X as a figure who spoke to the need to distinguish ourselves from the status quo of American culture to the extent that we are excluded from it. And I think Cone's work on both ends of his long bibliography continue with that tension. And so specifically, I'm thinking about like one of my favorite books that he wrote is Black Theology, Black Power. And in his memoir, he describes his experience working on that book as what he called, being down in a basement, I believe it was, listening to music and getting into the rhythm of this writing process. And he used this phrase that I didn't know how to understand until I had a similar moment a few months later, but he said he was swimming in blackness. And he describes like this fraught experience of writing about European theologians like Karl Barth. And he said that distinctly writing Black Power and Black Theology and the next book after that, he experienced this fluidity of expression. And he also experienced this sense of being in the company of not only the people on the street, for lack of a better term, but also with ancestors. And there's something about his end of life reflections on that early work that I think is really helpful, because I think there is both the spirit of Malcolm and Martin in there, but distinctly Malcolm X to the extent that he was able as a theologian to remain and always center his identity as a theologian, which for many people, it's like, okay, you have all these criticisms of white people's religion and Christianity, why not just exit and do other work? And Cone makes it clear that that thought crossed his mind also. But I think there's a commitment to Christianity and to Christian theology that runs all the way through Cone's work. But Cone also invites us to join him and extend on his work to the extent that he invites the sort of revelation of God as a distinction between Black folk and white folks. And I think that distinction is really, really important, because he was not, obviously, as a professor at Union Theological Seminary for almost 50 years, he was not a separatist, but he also was not interested in and rejected the notion that African Americans have it as their duty to assimilate into white culture, into an easy reconciliation. And I think that's extraordinarily difficult work to do from within theology. And he got Black theology, he didn't originate Black theology, but he moved Black theology significantly forward by insisting that it is not necessary for Black folks to subsume our identity into something external to us in the hopes that by so doing, somehow white people's hearts are going to be changed and things will get better for Black folks. But I think what he extends is a body of work that shows us that not only are you already distinct, but that the particulars of that distinction have to consistently be worked out, not as a narcissistic project, but as a way of being faithful to the revelation of God that has appeared to Black people in this particular context, despite all of the perfidy of white American Protestant religion and its pretense to, in some cases, genuine Christianity, which is simply not present. And so I think in that sense, you know, I see the spirit of MLK in Cone's work precisely to the extent that he was tenacious as a theologian to be theological and to not exit that task to do some other work, but very much like Malcolm X to the extent that he did not pull any punches and he did not flatter white supremacy or, you know, blunt the edge of his critique or his creativity as a way to fit comfortably into a status quo. And I think in that sense, his work is the embodiment, you know, of those two great figures, but much in the same spirit, I think, that we see in someone like James Baldwin. And I didn't have the privilege to study with James Cone. I came to Union the semester that he was on sabbatical, and the very next semester he passed away. But I was fortunate enough to have one conversation with him in private where he explained to me that he sees James Baldwin as someone who is to a certain degree in between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., and that James Baldwin was distinctly freer than either King or Malcolm X, precisely to the extent that he was not the leader of a movement. And so he had the freedom of not representing, you know, one religious body or another religious body, but that he was able to move fluidly through his own creativity and actually show people these distinct phases of his creativity as a thinker and as a writer and as a rhetorician. And so I think that's a gift that Cone bequeaths, you know, to theological reflection, of course, for African Americans in the United States, but on a global level, that there is a process of becoming and that there is the need to work out the particulars of this freedom that comes with the need to make a distinction, but to continue to clarify the terms of that distinction and the possibilities that it brings.
Oh, that's perfectly said. Thank you so much.
Powerful, powerful stuff, Jermaine. You know, I did take the Baldwin course with Cone. By the way, I have, he would allow me to record. I've got lots of recordings of his classes, audio recordings of his classes. And I was trying to decide what I wanted to do with them. Obviously, I'm not going to do anything commercial with them, obviously. I haven't turned them over to Union. I'm not sure that I'm going to. I've had a couple of conversations with people that suggest that I might want to do that. But I still have them, and they're rich, and just to listen to the sound of his voice and the way that he would laugh and so forth. I mean, one of the things that he said about Baldwin is that he thought of Baldwin as like scripture. It was like reading the Bible, reading James Baldwin. And I think with regard to what you're saying now, that the constraints that both Martin and Malcolm had held because of their position within these movements, James Baldwin did not have. He was free, and his freedom, I think, impacted both of them. One of the things about that I remember either reading or hearing that Malcolm said about James Baldwin, and one of the reasons why James did not speak at the at one of the, I think it was the '63 march, he says they won't let James Baldwin speak because they never know what he might say. And it was that kind of unmitigated freedom that he had struggled through, the things that he had struggled with, and that he was not going to allow anybody to snatch his voice from him. And I mean, and that kind of power and determination, that kind of audacity is something that we desperately need. You know, I'm in a structure. I'm in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. It calls itself the Freedom Church. And yet there are things in the so-called Freedom Church that I know aren't free. But, you know, behaviors that, you know, I've got to be careful. Perhaps I need to be cautious because I don't want to upset my bishop and that he might lift my appointment. I mean, so those are constraints that may keep me from, and the same with the Presbyterians. I mean, it's the same kind of stuff. in these structures. And yet at the same time, the question is, at what point do you don't want to commit professional suicide, but at the same time, you don't want to not be true to yourself. And to what extent are you prepared to, like, say, lose, save your soul by losing the world? And so holding that stuff in tension is always one of the things that we have to kind of keep in mind. And particularly when that you live in a society called America that will go through whatever hoops it needs to go through to tell whatever lies that it needs to tell, that in fact, the America that we live in is not very different from the America during the Civil War. I mean, it's shapeshift, so some things are different, but slavery has managed to shapeshift. And when Jermaine and I were talking a little earlier about the kinds of lies that America needs to tell itself in order to maintain its position, even up to January 6th, if you will, it is prepared to do. And it's not prepared to take much back talk from whoever it is that may push back against it. So these are perilous times. It is true that America could learn, has to learn, has not learned from Black people. But, one of the things that white supremacy does, and when I talk about white supremacy, I'm not talking about white people. I mean, to be clear about that, because what ends up happening often, and I'm I'm even reluctant to call white people racists, because it lets them off the hook. They'll start telling me all of the reasons whether or not that's kind of like a dead end conversation. I'm talking about a system called white supremacy that has its foot on the neck of every Black man, woman, and child everywhere you look. So when you are talking about a white supremacist system, in terms of its in terms of the way that it operates in the world, one of the things that the system can do, it manages, and I would love to hear what Jermaine has to say about this. One of the ways that white supremacy manages to hide is by invisibilizing the very people that it is oppressing. It hides behind them so that it doesn't look like what it actually is. So we can point to the police on the one hand and say, because the police officer that did this may not have been a white man, may have been a Black person, then that couldn't be racism, that couldn't be white supremacy, but it's the same system. So we just have to figure out ways to unmask it so that you can actually deal with these nefarious forces. And if America will not listen to Malcolm, Martin, and Medgar, I have no expectation that it will listen to me.
Well, I appreciate what you said about this kind of recalcitrant nature of this white supremacist system definitely does not require like a white person doing some obviously racist thing. But I wonder what you all think about this, because I've thought so much lately about the fact that Americans are not educated to think or to rethink or even unthink fundamental assumptions. And I think white supremacy survives not only because of people who are white supremacists who know very well what they want to accomplish globally as white supremacists, but white supremacy also has this inertia that comes from its ability to contribute to us not knowing how to actually raise critical questions about what's necessary. And when I engage students, oftentimes I hear our more pious students say things like, well, we know racism won't ever finally be solved in our lifetime, but in the sweet by and by, everything will be the way that it should be. And there's this way in which we lose our connection to how like white supremacy functions materially and within social ecologies and according to relationships and distinct decisions that people make. And I think a key decision that we often make and thereby play into white supremacy is to refuse to raise the right critical questions. And also, in addition to that, we somehow just assume along with white supremacy that, yes, this is inevitable. Yes, these problems have always been with us and human beings are flawed and therefore there's no real solution. We just have to remain vigilant. And there's a kind of fatalism in that passes for a cheap version of wisdom. And I think we have to be able to raise some of these questions that were present during the Reconstruction era. I read a biography of John Bingham, one of the authors of the 14th Amendment, just a couple of weeks ago, where he actually talks about the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment as the embodiment of Christianity in constitutional law. And I wasn't looking for that, and I didn't expect to see that. But one of the things that impressed upon me, that even in our in these founding documents, so to speak, during a time as dangerous and disappointing as Reconstruction, people were thinking about a world historical opportunity to get something right in the United States, that the country had always had an opportunity to get right, but instead decided not to get right because of greed and these other vices, vainglory, lethargy, cowardice. There's always a reason, and it almost always has to do with money and relationships, that it's too painful to do the right thing when it's time to do the right thing. So much so that now in the 21st century, we have people walking around on this planet, holding the highest office in the land, who have this concept that there are these great ideals that we have to always point to, but we can't actually behave as if they're real things because we have to have our feet firmly planted on the ground. I don't know if anybody watched that podcast that, let's see, it was Obama and Bruce Springsteen, where Obama gave us, his rendition of the civic religion. And it struck me that, he, perhaps in the tradition of some pragmatists and others, can say it's so important for us to keep these ideals close to our heart, but then to be very practical and mind those things that can be done right now. And this enormous gulf between the so-called ideal and the real, we live in that space. And if we continue to think of the ideal as something that only exists as an object for contemplation, where the greed and the backdoor dealing and the cynicism of everyday politics is just the reality that we have to deal with, and we can't think through that. I think this is what gives white supremacy so much vacant space to just simply run through the global body politic, because we've intellectually equipped ourselves to think this is the way that it is. And we think there's something wise or mature for having some grip on so-called reality. Whereas people of faith, especially Christian people who believe in virgin births and immaculate conceptions and people being raised from the dead and people walking on water, we can believe these types of things and say that there's something faithful about taking them literally sometimes. But then in our actual lives, we allow ourselves to say, yes, there is some reality in our minds, but we can't act as if it's real or as if it's possible, because we are stuck in this mundane plane where I don't know. So we have this way of leaving all this space for evil to find an occasion to take advantage of us, because we posit an ideal so far from reality that we let the current status quo call the shots on what's possible for the future. And I think this is probably the main power of white supremacy, operating literally in the minds of each person who thinks perhaps, oh, I'm being wise, or I'm being realistic, or I'm being practical.
Jermaine, I think because it is easier. It's easier to make room for that than it is to take the deep dive and to say these things can change. And it's not just white supremacy. White supremacy is not the only contaminant. It operates on so many levels. It operates in the level of patriarchy. A few months ago, I was responding to something that somebody said on Facebook. And, now, it's easy. I shouldn't say it's easy. It's easier for us to kind of point an accusing finger at white supremacy. And I was responding to that in something that somebody said about the church. But and I know that if I had said, put along with those two, with that particular, the head of that particular beast, if I had put patriarchy and homophobia, there would have been a completely different response to that. Because we allow these spaces to exist, and then we'll use the Bible as justification for holding these kind of arcane ways where it just doesn't make any sense. But it's easier because we are lazy, intellectually lazy. We've gotten to the place where people will make a statement, And I never will forget, and I think that Christopher Hitchens, who happens is an atheist, but he said something that I totally agree with. He said, any claim that can be made without evidence can be rejected without evidence. And so if you make a claim and then someone takes issue with the claim, and then they say, well, prove me wrong. I said, well, no, that's not the way the rhetorical process works. If you make a claim, it's up on you to provide evidence to sustain the claim that you've made. Right. But we live in a society where that's no longer required, a kind of constant dumbing down that allows people just to think whatever it is that they're told, depending upon who it is that tells it. And that's the other thing. It's not that, you make a claim and it's not what you say, but who it is that says it. So it's the preacher, it's the governor, it's the president, it's the person who is in a position of authority who ought to know. Well, you need to ask a question. We've got doctors who do things to people all the time. You don't engage your doctor in a discussion about what he's getting ready to put in your body.
Right.
So because I can't question. Well, yes, you can question him. And let's not even begin the conversation about questioning God, because that automatically is one of those things that a lot of people are afraid is going to get you. And Christians are particularly, I haven't dealt with a lot of other people of other faiths, although I recognize the validity of all faith. I am not a religious imperialist by any stretch of the imagination. But this talk of Jesus is what fires my soul in the ways in which I can talk about it. I recognize there are other ways to talk about it. But this kind of intellectual laziness that then is wrapped up into some assumption about what it means to be faithful, as if somehow or another doubt and faith are not inextricably bound together. That if doubt does not have some place in your faith, then I question what your faith is based on. If it has not come up against some of the really earth-shattering realities, then what is that faith? There's a lot of work to be done. Which means that as long as there is as long as my mom is a friend of mine used to say, these bag of bones and this hank of hair that we're carrying around, as long as we're breathing breath, there is work to do. But you are absolutely right about the way in which we will allow certain high-flown rhetorical assumptions to get lost in the day-to-day. And this is the thing. And then I'll stop when I say this, because in the when Jesus talked about the sheep and the goats, there's so many things about that story that is so powerful. But one of the things that I find so powerful about it was that he didn't say anything about how you believe. It was not a question about how you believe. It was how you behave. I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me to drink. I was sick and you visited me. Well, when did we see you sick? And, if as you have done it to the least of these, you've done it to me. Right. And the goats were, when did we see you and didn't do? When you haven't done to the least of these. So that opens up a whole nother can of worms that we need to have a conversation about. This is not about what you believe. This is one of the wonderful things about Cone, because he said, white theology is work. Their preoccupation is right belief, right? How you believe correctly. How sound is your theological postulate? But what Jesus seemed to be saying, and what Cone was saying at this point, was it's not what you believe, but it's how you behave. Right relationships. You can't tell me how much you love the Lord, who you've never seen, and you hate your brother who you see every single day. And this is the conundrum that I think that I think the church has to come to grips with. But because once again we're wrapped up in these notions of what it means to be successful, what it means to have a good church, what it means to be doing the work of kingdom building, as if you got 45 or 50 or 60 churches, then that means you're doing more kingdom building than if you only have one and you all can barely manage to keep the doors open and the lights on. It challenges us to think deeply on a number of different levels. And my argument is, as I started, is in part, we don't do it because it's easy not to do it, or easier not to do it. I mean, it's a tremendous weight that we end up carrying, but it's easier to carry that weight. It's easier to swallow a camel. So we will strain out a gnat, but we will swallow a camel.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think what is easy, we should always be suspicious of the things that are easy but sound lofty. And one of the things that, you know, in terms of faith or believing the right thing that I think we have to keep in mind is that faith has to be fidelity. Like it has to be fidelity to something, which always implies an action. And, you know, I've been, you know, doing a deep dive in philosopher Alain Badiou recently. And, you know, he talks about fidelity to an event of truth. And what's interesting to me about what he says is that there's something utterly material about the decision to be faithful to something that emerges to your consciousness that fits within the in the situation, but it stands out from the situation. And that fidelity simply means that you follow in your thinking and in your action what emerges to you out of a situation. And for me, the gospel has to be understood in that way. If we can take the gospel seriously, that the power of God is made manifest in this display of Jesus deciding to live a human life despite the threat of death, then the only way to be faithful to the event of Jesus's life and the resurrection of the Christ is to live our social, intellectual, and political lives in the same way, which means you live as if the threat of death or annihilation or marginalization is nothing to you, because you understand that that is not the full extent of life. But I think if, on the other hand, we focus instead on making sure your respect for a certain dogma is intact, then we lose out. And so how is it that a person can become, in the 21st century, you know, a Christian, but then you don't have the capacity to raise questions about, like, is God really a man or not? Or you become a Christian in the 21st century, but then the status quo of like gender binaries and sexual binaries are something that somehow is just too much for you to break through intellectually and spiritually. So I think this sense in which the Christian life is not a move towards some conservative convention has to be emphasized, but that to say that the person who is Christian is being faithful to a reality within the world that breaks through any sort of finite and inferior constructs that limit the freedom of a human being to be all of what God had in mind, so to speak, when creating the world and persons within it. And I think we would have a different political attitude if we understood that, you know, Jesus didn't have a death wish. Jesus was not suicidal. Jesus was so full of the Spirit of God that the threat of death simply was meaningless to Jesus. And he lived his life in a way that was so promising of real life that it was a threat to people who relied upon death to organize an extractive economy. And in the 21st century, how can we miss that? Well, we miss that because we have, unfortunately, pastors who are preoccupied with economic security more than they're concerned with fidelity to the gospel. And for that reason, of course, that means we have work to do within churches, but we also have work to do outside of churches, because more and more people are having to choose to be faithful by leaving the church rather than staying within it. And I think as clergy, we have to be careful that we are not the cause of people having to leave the church to be faithful to the gospel.
Right. You know, but this has always been the struggle. People have always, that's how John the Baptist had such a following in the desert, because people saw what was going on inside and they said, no, this ain't it. This can't be it. So they went out to the desert. We have this, the Black church was referred to as the invisible institution. It was the institution where we had to go to the hush arbors and the brush harbors and to drag a big iron kettle out into the middle of a clearing and stand around it and then in a circle, we would stick our heads down in the empty pot so that it could muffle the sound of our prayers, while the others watch while I pray, as Jesus said in the Garden of Gethsemane, because we were watching for the dogs and watching for the overseers and watching for those, because those overseers knew that those folks that had dragged that iron pot out into the middle of the clearing, they were on purpose and they were dangerous.
Right. Right.
They were practicing a ministry of Jesus as opposed to a ministry about Jesus, because the ministry of Jesus will put you on a cross. Right. But a ministry about Jesus can be whatever it is you decide you want it to be about.
Exactly.
And that's what we've got. And that's, that, and so the struggle in the 21st century is as much the struggle of the first century. You know what I mean? The same issues that Jesus had with the religious authorities in his day, he would have with bishops and preachers of this day.
Right.
When they say ain't nothing new under the sun, right? In some sense, there's a power, but there's also a kind of comfort in that. And the comfort is that not only are you not alone, because sometimes that's what trauma will do. You will feel as though you are alone. But when we really, and trauma has a way of hiding. I've got one of these days, I'll tell you a story about when it became palpably aware to me what the hoses in Birmingham aimed at those children, and opening up the Jet magazine and seeing the picture of Emmett Till. And I was a child when I saw that, and I was not looking at a newsreel. I was looking at the daily news. I was looking at the news as it was broadcast on one of the 3 stations that I grew up watching in Detroit. And when I opened up that Jet magazine, which came into all of our homes, and saw that picture, I didn't know what to do with that. And I didn't realize how traumatized I had been by those 2 events until I was a grown man, married in 2015 or 2012 or something like that. Wow. Then I could kind of trace what those 2 things had done to me back then. So trauma has a way of hiding. And one of the things that trauma does is it does make you feel like you're alone. So one of the ways in which I think that it's so valuable to recognize, to draw, and this is why I was saying to you about the kind of work that you're doing in terms of your dissertation, and how you can draw a line directly from Reconstruction to January 6th, in terms of the way in which it continues to show its ugly head. Is that it gives you a sense of comfort in knowing that other people have struggled, and they are a part of, to use Paul, or not, it wasn't Paul, I don't know, he wrote this anyway, that great cloud of witnesses that is saying to you, the great people of faith, but I add to those great people of faith in the Bible, I add my grandmother, I add people like Malcolm and Martin, I had Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass, that great cloud of witnesses that says to me, don't look to the left or to right, but look to Jesus, the author and finisher of your faith, and run the race that is set before you. That gives me a measure of comfort. And listening to what the work that you're doing right now, Jermaine, gives me a sense of comfort, because I know there's somebody out there doing that work. And even if I can't do it and don't know that the work needs to be done, I can draw succor from the fact that you're doing that work.
That's so encouraging for me to hear you say that, because the process of doing it is so much the opposite of comfort.
Right. That's the point.
Right. But to hear you say, and that's what I would hope, is that by working on the grisliest part of our history as Americans and as Black folk, which is this Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction time period, where Black death was simply like a part of political calculus.
Right.
And there's so many people who know that, in our bones, but we don't see it necessarily in scholarship, or we don't necessarily see it in the right array of forms. It's discouraging. And I think there is something about us being able to externalize something to a certain extent that takes the trauma of internalization and it at least breaks it up in some pieces so that you can get some perspective on it. And I mean, the other day I was reading this book called 100 Years of Lynching. And this is relatively late in my research, but I mean, it's, maybe 1 to 2, sometimes 3 articles per page that just, same descriptions, different location, similar kind of sequence and protocol of, somebody invents fake rape charges, or somebody can't pay their sharecroppers, and when a fight happens, somebody dies, and then, or somebody gets punched in the face, and then a lynch mob forms within hours, and then there's burning, and then there's dismemberment. And I'm just going through all of these pages trying to like do work, but I'm also realizing that just the very process of putting it to the side in order to be a scholar is in a sense a trauma of its own. But knowing that, there are Black folks who are coming after me, there are Black folks who have gone before me, who never, especially the ones who have gone before, who never dreamed that someone would be able to write about this in a theological frame that actually shows responsibility among liberals, conservatives, Northerners, bankers. Like, it's not just all those people in the South, but it's a wide range of people who created an environment where it made the most sense for global missions. It made the most sense to allow Black folk to be treated this way. And I do this work with Cone always in my head, and others, because like his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, was the first inkling that I got that I could study this theologically and as an ethicist and make a contribution while also getting some clarity on certain things. And his book, deals with it in a very different way than I do, but I always see myself sort of standing on his shoulders because he did this work. And I hear this, from my advisor, Gary Dorian, and others, that writing that book took a lot out of Cone.
It did.
And Dorian, he even told me, he's like, take a break every once in a while, because I know Cone had to do that when he was writing. And it was so helpful for me to hear that, because otherwise, just plow through it. You didn't experience these things. Why should it be heavy on you? But I think it's that trauma of knowing that you have been the sorts of people to whom this thing can happen with impunity, that we carry that with us from the time that we're children, and we don't know what to do with it. And I think one of the tasks of Black theology is to be able to take that experience of Black people out of the realm of tragedy, right? Because tragedy has so many connotations of fate, inevitability, nature. And we have to switch gears, I think, and be able to say, like, no, these were choices that intelligent people made because they wanted political power, they wanted some form of expedience to help them make more money. And as evil and demonic as extralegal violence against African Americans is and was, we can't let our explanation of it go to the realm of the hereafter or the supernatural before we're able to grasp the nuts and bolts materiality of it. And I think if we don't do that, we fall into a trap that, I actually learned about from composer Wadada Leo Smith. Wadada Leo Smith wrote this beautiful piece of music on his album 10 Freedom Summers. And it's a piece, this particular piece I'm thinking of is dedicated to Emmett Till. And Wadada Leo Smith is a Muslim, and so he has a different understanding of Christology. I'll just put it that way. And what he told me when I interviewed him about this piece, he explained how the structure of the piece functions in order to change the image of Emmett Till that we have available to us. And so the piece, which I won't get into all of the exegesis of the piece, but basically he says that what happened to Emmett Till happened by people who chose to make him alone and isolate him and do something evil to him in order to express their power over the direction of human relationships. And for Wadada Leo Smith, he composes this piece in such a way that the most intense violence that happens to Emmett Till takes place after Emmett Till's spirit leaves his body and reascends back to dwell with the Creator.
Wow. Yeah.
And I struggled for so long with that interpretation of the piece, precisely because of like our Chalcedonian way of wanting to keep body and soul together, especially as we think through like the humanity and divinity of Christ. But when I thought through what that really meant, it dawned on me that what Wadada was doing through this piece and his explanation of it is he's providing an alternative image for Black people, which is to say, it's not necessary for us to develop an image of ourselves that is rooted in nothing more than the worst that whites can do to us. Right. That we don't shy away from that image, but it's precisely, like, I think part of what Cone develops is this need to make a distinction, which is to say, we're not necessarily separatists, but to say that what those evil people did to Emmett Till is not an image of who we are, but instead it's an image of who they are.
They are.
And so ultimately, like in his composition, he says the way that the music proceeds is that the listener should retain the image of Emmett Till that you got not in the casket that was used for political propaganda so powerfully, but instead the image of his life in Chicago, where he has that wide brimmed hat and that full cheek smile. And so I think part of the task then of Black theology is to assist Black people in making this kind of determination and not to default to an image of the self that is just the sum total of all these intersections, which are like vulnerabilities you have before a court of law, but instead to like make the determination that the image of who you are doesn't start with what can be done to you with impunity, but it starts by regarding how God appears to you in your own humanity. And like Cone talks about this in Bearden, in Bearden, Arkansas, the revelation of God is the way God appeared to Cone in the lives of those people in Bearden. And so I think that's a huge challenge for us nowadays, because we get wrapped up in the Twitter sphere and all of these other platforms. We start to see ourselves as nothing more than the imprint of what can be done with us with impunity. And then we leave vacant this space, spiritually and socially, where we have to continue the work of constructing who we are for ourselves, who we are for our own sakes, as objects of a creator's desire to create, not merely just the imprint of like white supremacy's foolishness or patriarchy's foolishness or homophobia's foolishness.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Jermaine. I mean,
can I ask some questions related to? I apologize for interrupting, but so some of the things that, I mean, this has been really incredible. Cone's notion that white theology is not Christian, I mean, it is very sort of is impactful, to put it mildly, and is very important to think through. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, but related to some of the things that you've been very powerfully, both of you, talking about. It's something that I tend to think about in my own sort of in my own sort of religious, spiritual, epistemological frameworks that I'm thinking through, which is the very materiality of things, right? The materiality of life, but the materiality of the religious life, which is something Cone, of course, talks a lot about, as far as the spilling of black blood and how the cross becomes the cross and the lynching tree are sort of mirror images in many ways of each other. So again, this is an epistemological, philosophical quandary that I've been facing for some time now, and I was hoping to get your insights on, which is that we have this incredible tradition, the Christian tradition, which, of course, I have no doubt about its incredible power and beauty and depth. I mean, it's not just one tradition, of course, it's this huge tradition, but Christianity is deeply powerful and redemptive and so forth. I don't doubt that. At the same time, we have this very real history, European history, of brutality, colonial brutality in the colonies and slavery and on, which is underwritten very bizarrely, very often it seems, by this Christian theology. I mean, sort of Cone makes the point that Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth, of course, he's not part of the Roman Empire. He's a Palestinian Jew. He's opposed to the empire. So to say that Christian theology is part of the empire, however that empire's constituted is problematic. So a question that I can't help thinking about, and I don't have a simple answer to, and you've both mentioned the issue of trauma, historic trauma in one's own personal history. So of course, I, as you both know, I have a deep affinity for Christianity in general, but in particular to Orthodoxy. And not to say rah, 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 Orthodoxy or whatever, or bust, but the Orthodox understanding of religiosity, right, is very much, I'm talking about the issue of this, the idealization of things, having these ideals and the sort of disconnect between the ideal and the reality that Jermaine very, very powerfully pointed out. So in an Orthodox context, not to say that it's only in an Orthodox Christian context, but I think it's very powerfully there that the body is absolutely inseparable from one's religious life. One literally stands in prayer for 2 hours. It's insane. The first time I attended an Orthodox prayer service, 3 hours in a Russian Orthodox. It's insane. It's insane. I went through this process of thinking, what on earth am I doing here? I don't understand a word they're saying. What am I doing? And then I remember sort of going through this process internally of, oh, this is making sense now. Then it didn't make sense, but it was impacting me as far as I could tell, as far as I was concerned, on a level that was super rational, right? And that the traditions, historically speaking, and just, I mean, factually speaking, Protestantism comes onto the scene relatively late, right? In this sort of, but then Catholicism has its own flavoring, and that's tied in with, that's, tied to power, of course. And so the question that I'm struggling with, so these are some of my thoughts. And the question, I guess, is, how can, to my mind, a deeply powerful, redemptive, salvific tradition such as Christianity then lead to such abominable atrocities century after century, right? And this sort of nascent theory that I have about this, and it's completely nascent and completely a theory, but I can't help but thinking along these lines, and please, I'd love for your insights on this, that we have this immense, and language is absolutely limited, right? And so, but we do the best we can with the language that we have. We have this immense event of the crucifixion of Christ, at which, to put it in these terms, as it were, it's a traumatic event as far as, I mean, if we stay with that, then it's pure trauma. Christ died on the cross for our sins, yes, but he died on the cross. So that becomes sort of Western theology, Western Christian theology's obsession. It's about it's not only about the crucifixion. Of course, there's Christ's resurrection, but and you see where I'm going with this. In Orthodoxy, of course, the crucifixion happens, but it doesn't stay there. And I'm not pretending Orthodoxy has all the answers either, but the focus becomes on Christ's resurrection and his, that's the focus. So it's a celebratory sort of understanding. So this is a long-winded way of putting my nascent theory, which is that to what extent can we understand some of the horrific sort of actions of the West that have happened throughout history and continue today in the name of Christianity very often, not only, but very often. To what extent is it a result of this trauma? I mean, Christ's crucifixion isn't a traumatic event ultimately in its full breadth. It's ultimately a salvific event, of course, but where it's been interpreted as this traumatic event, where that trauma hasn't been worked through, again, this is a theory, and that becomes lodged in the psyche of the Western experience, and then we go and inflict it on everyone else because we haven't done the bloody work, right? And I mean, again, this is super sort of armchair theorizing, but it's I was hoping I could get your views on that a little bit.
Jermaine, do you want to? Yeah, I know it's a lot. One of the things that, what was it Kierkegaard said, that either the New Testament is correct or Christendom is. This is because the dichotomy between what the New Testament says and how Christendom, not Christianity, but Christendom as an institution behaves. The gulf is too wide to say that the two exist. One is, there's the difference between precept and praxis. What you believe and how you behave. And that, obviously it's not quite that simple. But people, like institutions have often lied and have subverted the truth to use toward their own ends. We can certainly see that kind of behavior. And I don't know that if it's, it certainly gets much worse when what you can do, then your behavior, then you can say it's God inspired. So that puts the stamp of authenticity on some horrible work that you are engaged in. Doesn't make it any less horrible. There's some things that I would imagine Jesus said, listen, don't use my name in the middle of this mess that you're doing, because I don't have nothing to do with that. I don't, this is something that you all have created. Own up to it. Don't put it on me. I don't have anything to do with that. He said and he was not a Christian. He lived, born, and died a Jew, resurrected a Jew, as far as I know. So this notion that somehow or another, that you're taking the Christian gospel, and as opposed to using it as a tool for liberation, it becomes a tool for subjugation. Rather than setting people free, you're enslaving people. At one point, he said to the religious leaders of his day, "You are putting obligations on people that you have no intention of lifting a finger to answer." So, I'm just nibbling around the edges of that. I mean, I know that I haven't done anything that even resembles a deep dive to that really very, very profound question. But it certainly is layered, and it's operated throughout history. It operated before Christianity. It's just how people pervert the truth or pervert a truth.
Yeah, beautifully said, DeForest. I had like the same question resounds in my head all of the time. And I think for me, the question is probably more fruitful than any particular answer that I'm ever able to give to it. Because on one hand, I don't want to exempt Christianity from the things that Christian people have done. At the same time, I can't rightly saddle Christianity with responsibility for all the things Christians have done. I can't really think of many atrocities committed by Christians that don't have analogs in either other religions, philosophies, or like non-religions. But having said that, I am a Protestant Christian. And so I am responsible to like think through this as if I'm responsible to like name the truth and do differently and hopefully inspire others to do so. And so I look at the context of the United States and the process of founding what we call the United States of America, because Native American genocide was not only an activity that Christians engaged in, but you even had poetic or theopoetic expressions explaining it and justifying it from folks like Cotton Mather, for example, who imagined his own people as the new Israel sent by God to redeem this nation from a group of people that he called savages, who were oppressing the land by refusing to develop it according to that particular group's understanding of development. And this is a powerful theopoetic idea that, of course, aided people's capacity to have other people join them in what was a devastating pattern of destruction and genocide and dispossession of so many groups of indigenous people. And that was a distinctly Christian thing to do in terms of who did it and why. Even when it came to suppressing the slave trade, I mean, W.E.B. Du Bois does such a brilliant job at giving not only a historical, but an ethical rundown of the process by which Americans in both the North and the South made decisions to allow the slave trade to continue to flourish for economic reasons and for reasons of political expedience until it took a bloody civil war to get rid of what both sides knew was unsustainable and wrong the whole time. And there were Christian ideas flowing through both anti-slavery and pro-slavery all at the same time. Even those who believe that slavery is wrong, but it's part of my civic and Christian duty to uphold the property rights of Southerners. So we have to postpone it, or we have to take a laissez-faire approach to it. These are all things that have taken place in the United States under Protestantism. And so American Protestants, we can't separate ourselves from the things that we've actually done, in part because those things influence how we continue to think about politics and how we continue to think about so-called race relations. This idea that, oh, in heaven, things will be reconciled, but now we just have to be practical. Like, that's a distinctly American Protestant attitude. I'm not going to say it doesn't show up in other forms of Christianity and other religions, but it's part of how we think of now as not the time to do our absolute best. And for me, that has led me to thinking more specifically about the Orthodox tradition, and especially this notion of divinization. When I first heard of the concept of divinization, I very quickly dismissed it as a kind of like overly optimistic and like unfaithful foolishness. Like, oh, that's the root of all of our problems. Human beings thinking that they can become like God or become perfected. And recently, my attitude has completely shifted on this entirely, because as I pay attention to thinkers like Maximus the Confessor, and even earlier people like Evagrius and others, they had a process of contemplation and study and prayer that actually aimed at paying attention to what is it that brings conflict between the divine in humans and the human in humans. And that has become a really important question for me as I'm researching the Reconstruction era time period, because I'm realizing that this conflict between we want to exist as a nation, we want to flourish and be wealthy, is not in itself a bad thing, but the extent to which it comes into conflict with the highest possibilities of being a democracy, an economic democracy, a social democracy, a transracial democracy. All of those things are possible and have always been possible, like in our nation. But there are certain, to borrow this old monastic language, there are certain passions that put our existence as a body politic, so to speak, in conflict with our capacity to actually become what is possible for us to become. And so it's our greed, it's our laziness, it's our resentfulness, and it's all these dishonest ways we have of thinking about what is possible. The sense in which I shouldn't be made to feel uncomfortable to accommodate for someone else. I shouldn't have to be taxed in order to repair the damage done to generations of people because of
the whole
genocide,
discussion of
enslavement.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think really paying attention to like that monastic tradition is helpful for me, because it's helping me pay attention to what is it that keeps us from deciding to endure the pain necessary to actually overcome these things that we kid ourselves and say, oh, it's impossible, it's natural, it's tragic, it's just sin. I'm like, no, I think God has done something more interesting in the creation of human beings than to simply put a cap on our capacity to grow at racism and sexism and capitalism. It's like, if that's our cap, then we could call it quits now. And there's nothing, God could send, a flood tomorrow and wipe us all away if this is the best that we can do. So that's partly how I'm thinking, like, what is it about our way of thinking about reality that makes us think that we are not responsible for the divinization that God has actually made possible? Because God's spirit is in us. And so
yes.
To say like, oh, we're finite, we can't do this, we can't do that. I'm like, it sounds like humility and piety, but it's actually a kind of
cop out.
It's a cop out, and it's unfaithful, and it's demonic, because it makes us people who are unable and unwilling to respond to what God as creator has already made possible, and as a form of fake piety.
Yeah. I'm gonna need to come off of this and come back on it on my own home Zoom, so my wife can do something else with another Zoom. So pardon me, I'll be back in like less than a minute. Okay.
Beautiful. And Hassan, if you could say a little bit more about the Orthodox tradition in this vein, like how do you see the Orthodox tradition like actually helping us change our attitude about what is possible for us to overcome, you know, in ourselves? You're muted.
I'm certainly no authority by any means. I mean, just in general, broad brushstroke terms, I would say that, and this is something I've thought a lot about over the years, in thinking, through and about the Islamic tradition, and thinking about some of the other traditions, and in keeping with some of the things that you just mentioned. The embodied nature of religion. I mean, I can't help but, and again, with due respect to, Protestants. I mean, and this is not a critique of Protestantism as such. It's just, or maybe it is. I mean, maybe I'm like, pretending that it's not. But I mean, I'm just trying to think through this philosophically as well. That the formation of the religious subject necessarily happens, and this is kind of a Foucauldian, subsequent Foucauldian analysis of things. But I mean, Foucault he wasn't the first to have this insight, but he's a big name, so maybe it's helps in that sense just to mention Foucault's name. But the Foucauldian insight is that the formation of the subject, whether religious, political, and on, happens necessarily through these disciplinary mechanisms through which we're put through, whether educational and educational in sort of secular sense, but religious sense, and on. And these disciplinary mechanisms, of course, are meted out through controlling, through disciplining, of course, the bodily practices, right? Bodily practices are inseparable from the formation of ourselves, right? Of our subjecthoods, religious and otherwise. So there's something that happens historically, and Foucault was really pointing to this without necessarily having religious language, right? I mean, there's something happens historically in a European context where, right, famously we know with the birth of reason, right, there's the creation of unreason, and the birth of reason with a capital R necessitates a different understanding of the human subject, right? Historically, the birth of reason with a capital R, as famously cogito ergo sum, Descartes' formulation, that very, I think, therefore I am, is coming historically. The genealogy is through Protestantism, right? I mean, only a Protestant believer and thinker like Descartes could have come up with that formulation, right? I mean, I can't imagine any. Again, this is not me attacking Protestantism. Just as a philosophical. I mean, like trying to think through this philosophically. I mean, as you know, my entry point, like Protestantism, it was without question, to my mind, is a valid path to God, without question. I don't have doubts about that. But anyway, so my point being, Descartes sort of let me let DeForest. Descartes, what's the word? Prioritizing thought, right? I mean, what he does is a very interesting move as well, philosophically, insofar as where historically being with a capital B, right? The ground of being was what we related to in order for our very self, for our own being with a lowercase b, right? For our own self, sense of self, right? Through these practices, through connecting, as it were, I mean, in sort of, it may be more loftier terms, but I don't think it's that lofty, because mysticism was part and parcel of everyday lived experience religiously across the board. Like this was a universal thing. I mean, I think historians have, certainly in an Islamic context, and interestingly enough, it's through colonialism that Sufism, the sort of mystical path in Islam kind of gets sidelined as a result of colonial influences, which is fascinating, but that's another discussion. But my point being, the mystical path, right, through which mysticism historically, again, is part and parcel of the religious experience by and large, necessitates a physical orientation to God, right? And it's through our physicality that we come to realize, not in some theoretical sense, yes, we can write about it afterwards, but the mystical insight is deeply existential. It's a very lofty sort of state of being, of course, and very few people ultimately attain to the heights of it, but it's something that we're always treading towards. The mystic in his or her very being experiences being with a capital B. It's not because of my thought that I am, it's because of the divine I am that I am, right? Right. So all of which is to say, I guess, that the evolution, right? The way it sort of played out historically in a Western context, how we understand ourselves, how we understand our religious identities, how we understand how we relate to one another by virtue of the fact of how we understand God and so forth, has this strange coloring. I say strange because I think it's historically unusual. Like if we take yoga, for example, right, and the yogic, classical yoga, the yogic tradition, it's all about embodiment, right? We famously know, people recognize yoga for what it is, right? In a Western context, as this sort of physiological practice and things like that. classical yoga is quite different. It's comparable, but ultimately very different. It's a deeply mystical, metaphysical tradition. Any yogi, I had the great fortune of studying a little bit of classical yoga more recently, and it's deeply powerful. Any classical yogi will tell you immediately, will tell us that it's not about the theorization, it's about the practice. So anyway, all of this is to say, I'm going on and on about this, but you get my point that how we relate to one another, so a lot of the discussions that we have these days, say vis-a-vis the environment, we have to worry about the environment as if it's something outside of ourselves, and it's all very theoretical, it's very abstract. Is it really that big a deal? Yes, it's a big deal in theory, but for the mystical consciousness, there's no question the environment is inseparable from who I am, and vice versa. And I'll end on this point. Been going on for a while now, but I had the great fortune of speaking to this great Sufi sheikha, female master, Sheikha Fariha, just yesterday, and she put it really powerfully. I'd never heard it this way put before, and she was mentioning that this was what she learned from her teacher, that he said and says, he passed away some years ago. He put it this way, that man is not the microcosm, or the human being is not the microcosm, but the macrocosm. It's from the human being that everything emerges. And this is the sort of historic metaphysical understanding of things. And I think this is very in keeping with Orthodox Christianity's understanding of things. It's very in keeping with classical, Sufic or traditional Islamic understanding of things, that we existentially permeate one another and relate to one another in this profound way. So it's almost impossible, in an ideal sense, it's impossible to do injustice to someone else, right? The famous Pink Floyd line, strangers walking down the street, by chance two separate glances meet, I am you and what you see is me, or something. I forget that, but you see my point. Anyway, I'll end with that. That's a very sort of roundabout, circuitous way of responding to you.
No, right. Absolutely. That's so important. And what we started even talking about before we hit record was that, like, January 6th, for example, like that mob has been on the way for a long time. And decisions were made during, after, even before the Civil War that assumed that mob was only going to threaten Black folks. And so So it's okay to let a kind of lawlessness and a lack of like discipline and like social vice exist to placate those folks, because all they're going to do is just keep some Black sharecroppers and some ne'er-do-wells in line. But when they start crawling through the window of the Capitol, the nation experiences it as a shock, because this little bitty teeny tiny thing that we call time like catches up. What you allow to happen, it catches up. You're not exempt from what you do to the environment, what you do through the law to make others vulnerable. It catches up, and then you have to deal with it. You have to deal with this contagion, as it said, this contagion of vice. You know, it's not just going out there and you're exempt from it, but it's coming from you.
You know, Martin said it. I mean, it almost in so many ways, and maybe because the language is simple, does not mean that it is not deeply profound. So when Martin says injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, there is a profound truth in that is just as profound as what we know to be the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now that, you know, it almost sounds too simplistic to have any real weight, but the great truths have often been so simplistic that even a child who understands it at 3 may understand it very, very differently at 33 or 63. But that's only as a result of time and place and experience, so that that what sounded had a certain relevance at 3 now has a far more profound relevance at 63. But it's still the same truth. The truth itself has not changed. What's happened is that you have changed as you grow, as you develop, as you mature. Then this truth it grows. It's like I think it was you that talked about. I'm trying to remember who it was that said that when you bury a it's a tree that you put on the ground. The roots go into the ground for 20 years.
Yes.
The bamboo tree. Before it emerges above ground, it's 20 years worth of root work that it's got to do before it even shows up.
Yeah, something like 10 years. Yeah, and then the next year it's like shoots up 20 feet.
And then right, exactly. So I mean, so it is. I remember I wrote down. I'm gonna decline that. Excuse me. There is. I put something once in Facebook. I said, dear white people, if you can be convinced to hate Black people, and that was not the word I used, it will not be long before you find yourself being treated like Black people. You know, so, you know, to the degree that America refuses to listen, it is to its own detriment. It is to its own division. It is to its own demise. Right. There is something that when this goes back to what you said, and kind of Hassan inspired you to begin these conversations. Dave Chappelle's come get these lessons, because we have something profound to teach America. But because America has made up its mind, and I was saying this before, you can't tell white folks anything because they know every dang thing. That even when they're wrong, they're right. You know. And that remains a kind of truth that is painful, but nonetheless kind of it's almost a shame that we are, and that there are other people across this globe to see. What were they singing when the Berlin Wall came down? They were singing "We Shall Overcome." During the April Spring, people in Egypt were calling people who had been involved in the civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s to say, what did you do? Because they're continuing to learn the lessons that Black people have just almost like some of the haiku masters. There's a story about a haiku master who was standing in the middle of a stream, writing these wonderful, mind-blowing poems, and then just throwing them away. And he would laugh as he wrote another, then he would throw it away. And so, and his disciples, his students, were scrambling to kind of catch, what was flowing away down the river, because we don't want to lose this. But he was laughing and just because it's like breathing. Our breath becomes that which can feed the world. Do you know that America, I was saying this to somebody, America not just thrives on our misery, but is enriched by our misery. It's enriched by the studies that they've done, the studies that they've done. Then they then go and turn into opportunities to apply for grants and make all kind of money,
right,
studying our misery.
Can I ask you? So this really, this is an uncomfortable but important question to my mind, and I was kind of skirting around it before, and maybe I'll be more precise. What is it about whiteness? What is it about the historic, not just whiteness as a notion, but again, this is this is not an indictment of white people as such, but Europe has a very strange history. I think it's human beings. We all absolutely have the capacity to be violent and to be vile and so forth. It seems to me Europe has unique sort of claims to violence and violence. Kind of right. White Europe, and what is going on there? I just cannot understand it. And again, some of my best friends are white people, so that's a joke, by the way.
If you were white and you were saying that, and you were saying that about black people, I would be all over you like a cheap suit.
It's intentional. But, yeah.
Right, that was an intentional, right? I understand. Yeah. Jermaine, would you take a swing at that, brother?
I'll give it a shot. I don't know if I would say, okay, so I'll say this. Thinkers like Josiah Strong, for example, in the late 19th century, historian John Fiske, they worked during a time period where Anglo-Saxon global dominance was understood as not only an inevitable event, but it was understood as what Anglo-Saxons should be leaning into. And so nowadays we don't use that same language politely, even though the same project is unfolding. But I think it was very important. It's very important to remember that after emancipation, there was an understanding that with slavery off of the moral ledger of the United States was thereby in a position to pursue its destiny as a redeemer nation. And so, writers like Josiah Strong and John Fiske and others, had a very distinctly social Darwinist understanding of what kind of racial hygiene was necessary in order to make the Anglo-Saxons and the Americans fit for this global task. And I'm fascinated with this time period in history because they imagined that the Anglo-Saxon family and a few of their, non-white associates would be precisely in the circumstance globally that we find ourselves in today. Except I don't believe that they expected the economic and technological ascendancy of Asia. And so I think there is a long-standing family of concepts within, Teutonic, Anglo-Saxon cultures that says that our notion of freedom, our notion of liberty, a certain type of federalism that maintains a maximum of autonomy locally with a minimum of federal control, but enough federal control to mediate between large bodies of powerful people, that is global progress. And to protect that and to expand that is a duty that, the Anglo-Saxon and the Teutonic person, actually man, it's the duty of the Anglo-Saxon Teutonic man to push that forward. And that became blended in with Protestant understandings of what Protestantism is, even to the extent that there was a particularly anti-Catholic iteration of that. which is to say that that Catholicism is anti-liberty because of its relation to monarchy through the papacy, etc. So before I think we have this distinct notion of whiteness that's more common today, there was among a certain group of people that the Anglo-Saxon human being and the Teutonic peoples have this global destiny, and they have this responsibility to develop spiritually and intellectually and politically so as to spread this superior way of being a human community across the globe. And I think we lose the historical trail sometimes because we're Americans often, and we can be anti-historical sometimes. But I do think that there is a distinct historical trajectory in philosophy, in history, in science, and certainly in religion, where this way of understanding the Anglo-Saxon race and the Teutonic race was on the forefront of people's minds, especially after slavery, because that seemed to be the time when, now that we've gotten slavery out of the way, now we can fight against, the Spanish Empire in the Caribbean and in the Pacific, and we can spread freedom. And so the ugliest forms of propaganda and like political cartoons show this kind of Redeemer Nation status.
Right.
And I think we're in the advanced stages of that, even though we've pulled back a lot of the offensive language. I mean, so much so that I think a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Seuss was like on the table, like we have to get rid of Dr. Seuss because he had these racist cartoons. And certainly Dr. Seuss had these racist cartoons.
Right.
And I was going to say but I guess it's not a but it's, and, he was just giving a cartoon illustration version of what American culture was doing and planning to commit Americans to do overseas. Right. So yeah, we could live without Dr. Seuss because there are better illustrators. But if we kick Dr. Seuss to the curb without asking ourselves, who asked him to illustrate this concept of the world and whose imagination was he asked to feed, then we won't be able to find ourselves today on the map and understand how we're just unfolding that reality, albeit with politically correct language a lot of the time.
And as far as that, I'm going to
say there's a kind of iteration of what they call the white man's burden. There are two books that I think are instructive, and certainly not the only ones. One is by Toni Morrison called "Playing in the Dark." It's a powerful, powerful text, and another one by Charles Mills called "The Racial Contract." That really talks about white supremacy and how it just is spread everywhere. It's omnipresent in that sense, and in the ways in which it operates. So there are these things that we begin to see, and so that sweeping away Dr. Seuss or not sweeping away. And I love how people are saying to me, taking this frowning on what they call cancel culture. And I said, I haven't had conversations with these folks, because if they were to say that to me, then I would say, well, you tell me what is more of a cancel culture than white supremacy? If white supremacy is not a cancel culture, then tell me what is. You know what I mean? So give me a break that you're upset because now, and there's some question about whether or not it was Dr. Seuss's family who were the people who actually control, what Dr. Seuss books get published or not, that they were the ones who kind of pressed in and talked about removing some of the books. But what it does do, Jermaine, to what you were saying, is that if you just kick Dr. Seuss to the curb without interrogating what it was that he was actually doing, then again, it's easy to do that as opposed to actually, or even decrying the kicking to the curb of Dr. Seuss, but without investigating what it is that he actually means, what he meant, and what it is, and what place what he means and meant holds in today's present reality, because it's all about not being able to do the kind of introspective work that America needs to do. I said this to you, I think yesterday, Hassan, that white people are self-absorbed and self-involved, but they are not self-reflective. That's been my experience. They don't do too much in terms of looking at themselves. They're busy trying to figure out how they can be the center of everything without actually having to ask the tough questions that any sane person, because you see, there is a kind of insanity involved in all of this. There's a soul sickness. You know, we talked a little bit about this yesterday also, that Azad, when Elijah Muhammad made the assertion that the white man is the devil. When I remember people being all in a ruckus about him, saying that, talking about Yaqub and how these doctors had gotten together and created white men in a laboratory, and that it's the work of the devil. Well, whether white people are the devil or not, certainly the behavior that they have involved in, displayed toward colored nations across the globe is certainly demonic. There was nothing redeeming about the way in which white society has behaved. It is very much like a virus, if you will, particularly as it pertains to how it's impacted upon Black and brown and yellow and red people across the globe throughout their history. So it's, and these are hard questions to ask, and even in some cases more difficult to answer. But when we start to look more deeply, and it's hard to do it dispassionately, and I'm not necessarily saying that we should take the passion out of it, because I think there's deep passion in it. I'm not sure about this notion about being objective. How can you be objective? That is another kind of Western notion that seems to me to be kind of weird. It's
like a bludgeon that's used to beat us over the head.
Oh yeah, right.
It's like you're not being objective.
Supposed to be upset about it, right?
It's just techniques of control and domination.
It's a way of controlling the dialogue. That's
right,
really
exactly. Right.
Yeah.
Well, so and to that point, and to some of the points that Jermaine you made also, and we'll slowly wrap up. But this is a remarkably very illuminating, rich conversation for which I'm very grateful to you both for your time. Something I can't help but try to think epistemologically, and like what's happening epistemologically, like what are the paradigms through which we're thinking, what are the paradigms through which people are thinking in order to give rise to these manifestations of evil and so forth. And Jermaine, to your point about that, and I forget the scholars' names that you mentioned. Could you remind me of the two names that you mentioned in particular?
Right, two key figures. Josiah Strong. He wrote a book that was really popular. I think he wrote it in 1885 called Our Country. You can find that online. And John Fiske was a historian, and he had a really famous lecture series that he was invited to speak, I want to say at least 30 times globally. And it's called Manifest Destiny. And so, this is like a huge project for both of them, looking at these population transfers that happen between the UK and other parts of Europe into the United States. And so they're making plans how to continue that process and actually push down into Latin America and eventually conquer the globe with this like world salvific notion of, federalism and freedom and free trade, with the sights on other planets eventually.
That's so amazing. It's amazing in a scary way how prophetic that is, right? As you rightly pointed out.
And this was progressive. This is the progressive era.
Right.
And so people are saying that this is the progressive way of thinking of Christianity, of thinking of international governance, thinking of economic life. And the only thing that's changed is that we have pulled back the rhetoric so that it doesn't sound as racist as it is. It's still as racist, and it's advancing. But you've included a few people of color in strategic positions, and so now it looks redeemable or redeemed. But of course, we hear all this recent anti-China rhetoric, and I'm hoping that some of that anti-Chinese rhetoric reminds us of some of these 19th century roots of global dominance. Yeah.
Well, so to some of those points that you just mentioned, Jermaine, the progressivism and the myth of progress, right? So this thinking epistemologically, the myth of progress becomes a very important part of the modern Western imagination, right? Imaginaire, and which is then spread to the rest of the world. And this is how we think we're inevitably progressing, right? From sort of lowly beings, from being amoebas, right, to through all these different creatures to ultimately the white man, right? And that's social Darwinism. And so again, so my sort of question, again, trying to think through things epistemologically, is, and I once put it like this, thinking through this, and occasionally I'll sort of make some comments on Facebook just to kind of mark what I'm thinking about certain things, that I'm more personally interested in evolution on the spiritual level than I am supposedly on the idea of evolution supposedly happening on a material horizontal level. And I say that because I think the theory of evolution, it's interesting how the theory of evolution underwrite so many of these projects, right? This is how things are. It means we're getting better and better. We've come from really lowly beings, and the lower forms in the human context are people with darker skin, right? So it's fascinating for me to think again. These are inklings that I have. To Jermaine's point, I'm not dispassionate about this. Like, it's something I feel in my gut. I can't quite articulate yet, but it's I'm sure I can be wrong in many of these intuitions, but it's the theory of it. I guess the point I'm trying to make, the theory of evolution as it's sort of promulgated en masse, right? It's a very interesting and weird theory. Like, if we simply, like, in bare bones sense, right? And even to raise these questions, it's like committing a secular blasphemy. How dare you? And because every age and every context has its own blasphemies, right? There's no such thing as we know very well. There's no such thing as complete free for all thought-wise. But anyway, I mean, I don't have an answer either way, but maybe as a provocation again, I wanted to raise that. Yeah.
But there's a distinctly, there's an intellectual and spiritual challenge to this notion of evolution, which, is more or less, it's a random response to the environment that takes advantage of the self-organizing capacities of matter. But there's no inevitable progress that comes with that. It actually requires like some intentionality in some direction and some spiritual training, because viruses reproduce themselves. But part of Joseph LeConte is one of these early thinkers who tried to give Christians a Christian interpretation of Darwinism, which is just as you said, nature produces these conscious beings. And for Joseph LeConte, the situation was such that the lower forms, or the lower human forms, depending on which of his books you're reading, their job is to feed the higher forms, so that as the higher form gets to higher and higher levels of consciousness, by default, the lower forms rise up with it.
Oh, wow. How convenient. How convenient for the higher forms, right? If you're a higher form. And how inconvenient. Well, it's convenient for the lower form because he or she or it would have been lowly if it were not for the higher form.
Right.
So
this is the son of a plantation.
Plays out on a social level, right?
Yeah, this was the son of a plantation owner who wrote this book after his father's fortune was destroyed by Negro freedom in the Civil War. And he writes all of this without speaking explicitly about Black people. But as a Black person, you have to read everything with paranoia. And it's not paranoid because it's true.
Right.
But then I read some of his other books.
Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean it's not true, right?
Right.
But I read some of this guy's other books where he states much more explicitly that it is actually like degradation to a white person to have your former help, your former slaves, make political decisions that you have to live with. And so this notion of evolution, which on one hand is just an observation of how nature works, but social Darwinism as an ideology is a poetic political response to the theory of evolution, often with a lot of mistakes that weren't fixed until the earlier part of the 20th century. But you can see European thinkers, especially ones who made their way to the United States, taking what they knew then about genetics and other observations about nature, and then letting a racist imagination run with it. And it had an enormous impact on politics and on the development of sociology and anthropology and these other disciplines. So much so that it's hard for as a Black person to even think about Darwinism without thinking of racism.
Right.
Not because Darwin was trying to get Black people, but so many other people who were high on Anglo-Saxon dominance read Darwin, and the sort of theo-poetic imagination takes off, and they say, oh, clearly the crown of all of evolution is like this white man who's thinking about the best way to organize planetary life. Surely that's what evolution has been getting at all the time. And that's an addictive idea that seals the fate for a lot of white Protestant religious and social thinking.
Right. And it is the root of a soul sickness.
Yeah.
It is deeply sick. You know, you use the word epistemology. One of the interesting concepts in, and I don't know if Charles Mills created this or he got it bartered from someplace, somebody, what he refers to as epistemological ignorance. This epistemological ignorance is what allows white people not to know a system called white supremacy, from which they benefit on a daily basis. And you don't have to be, and his argument is, you don't have to be a signator on this contract in order to be a beneficiary of the contract. But it's a psychological crutch. This ignorance is a psychological crutch. It keeps you from knowing what this system of white supremacy has done to others for your benefit. And because since you don't know, you can't be held accountable. And psychologically, it's one of the barriers that keeps you from assuming some responsibility for that system of which you are a beneficiary, which aligns with what it was that Malcolm was saying. I think at one point, either Malcolm said this or this is something that Cone said Malcolm said. I'm not really quite sure which, but what it was he says, if white people knew their history, they would hate themselves. So what they don't know about their history are these things that we've been talking about. And how it is managed, this notion of white supremacy has managed these notions have managed to work their way into every social science. And what he is saying is, with regard to philosophy, which is the crown of the social sciences, you don't get to talk about. You can talk about social science, you can talk about racism and sociology and economics and so forth, but you can't talk about it in the context of philosophy or theology, for that matter, because it's supposed to be above that. It's universal. But he said that is the danger of it, because it is clearly universal. I mean, and it is clearly infected almost every single thought system. So that when we talk about Hegel and Kant, when we talk about these great German these great German philosophers, when we talk about Arnold Toynbee, a great historian who could write, Black people have created nothing that is worth us paying any attention to, and it can make that argument. You can talk about the impact that Africans had on early Christianity, the first 6-7 centuries of early Christianity. So that when we're talking about monasticism, for instance, we're certainly talking about a little African, an old man by the name of Saint, and I'm always drawing a blank, Saint Anthony, who was, although not he was the father of monasticism, not because he was the first, but because he was the most influential. And how Athanasius, another African, who wrote the story of this man who was a holy man, who was able to embody the divine to such a degree that people found themselves crowding to this man's monastery out in the middle of the Egyptian desert for years. He was a man who lived to be 105 years old, almost 2,000 years ago. So I mean, those kinds of contributions that not just to Christianity, but to world civilization, period. They don't know that. They don't want to know it. And our obligation, this is one of the things that I feel obligated to do, is to teach us so that we're not looking at Christianity, quote unquote, as the white man's religion. It's not the white man's religion.
Right.
It came out of Africa, not out of Europe.
This is incredible. Both of you, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry to have to. I'm conscious of the fact that Jermaine is teaching in 2 minutes, a minute and a half.
Oh my goodness! Yes.
No,
yes, yes.
not at all. But this has been an incredible pleasure and honor. I'm truly, truly, truly grateful to you both, and God bless you. And we will continue these discussions.
Jermaine, is your class online? Is your class online?
It is online. Yeah. So I'm TAing for Professor Dorian social ethics.
So yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to look to Hassan to give me your number. I would love for us to continue these conversations. So
powerful, so beautiful, so necessary. I mean, really, God bless you both. And I'm sorry to have to sort of cut you off midway, DeForest. But
no, that's okay. I understand.
Take care, and I really look forward to talking to you again soon. And God bless you.
God bless you both. God
Thank
bless
you.
Okay. Take care of yourself, Jermaine.
All right. Honor to meet you, Pastor.
It's a pleasure to meet you, my brother. We will be talking.
Absolutely. We'll stay in touch.
Yes. Okay.
Bye-bye for now.